Please welcome Vice President of Community Engagement at CBiz and Chair of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, Carolyn Watley.
Good morning. Welcome to the KC Chamber's annual Economic Forecast Breakfast. 2020 has been a difficult year for all of us, both as business leaders and as individuals. A deadly virus has brought illness, death, and record unemployment and unimagined stress to our businesses and our personal lives. Minority businesses and communities have been particularly hard hit. But today, we're turning the page on 2020 and looking ahead to what's in store for us in 2021. There are already signs of recovery, as you'll hear today from Frank Lenk, Chief Economist for the Mid-America Regional Council, in his annual economic forecast. And we'll hear the stories behind the data with Daniel Serda of LISC, Dr. Faisal Khan of Samuel U. Rodgers, and small business owner Amy Slattery of Odimo. They'll talk about the road to recovery in a panel discussion moderated by Armada corporate intelligence partner and author of the Chamber's daily business intelligence brief, Chris Kuehl. Once the discussion is finished, the panel discussion, will open up a number of discussion pods where you can ask questions and talk with today's speakers. And please feel free to move from room to room. I'd especially like to thank the sponsors of today's economic forecast. BMO Harris Bank is the cornerstone sponsor for the forecast. Black & Veatch, Blue KC, and SS&C are impact sponsors. Thank you all so much for your support. With his data analysis and dry wit, our first speaker is a fixture at our economic forecast events. Frank Lenk has provided the Chamber's forecast for several decades now and is always illuminating. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Lenk, Chief Economist for Mid-America Regional Council.
Thank you, everyone. Please share my screen. So we've been monitoring the impact of COVID-19 on the economy since the shutdowns began, and we're able to do that in large part because of a grant from the Civic Council and KC Rising that allowed us to purchase the national forecast that we need in order to drive our local model. Starting first with the national forecast, we have made substantial recovery nationwide. We're back about halfway from where we were in February, but it does look like the trends are leveling off and the going might be slower from here on out. This is just this unemployment insurance claims, just showing you the unprecedented nature of how many people were thrown out of work so quickly. And I'm showing you the Great Recession's level by comparison. We're still well above what was the prior high during the Great Recession. The progress has been substantial. It's 80 some odd percent lower than it was at its peak, but still the number of unemployment insurance claims are 4 times what they were going into the recession. It takes a long time, a long period of economic growth to make any progress towards sort of racial equity and an inclusive economy. This is showing you the unemployment rates for Blacks, Whites, Hispanics, and Latino and Asians. And the black line is the one at the top that's always the highest, but the differences were narrowing. And then in just a couple of months, all that has been thrown out. And we see that those disparities are emerging again. Latinos were thrown out of work the most initially, but have shown the most progress, while progress for Blacks has been much more subdued. So we purchased this forecast from Moody's Analytics, and they have several scenarios, and I'll go through a couple of them. In their baseline case, these are the key assumptions. And they're basically assuming that there is no further shutdowns of the economy, even though there likely to be a third wave that we're going through right now. The Fed keeps its Fed funds target near zero into 2023. Oil remains stable. That there is another stimulus package of about 1.5 trillion, but it won't probably occur until after the next president is inaugurated. That small businesses, which have been hurting and are having trouble keeping themselves half open, that the bankruptcies remain sort of at a manageable level, and that whatever domestic and international political tensions there are, they remain also manageable. So these are the scenarios that I'm providing for you today that look at the baseline in the blue, and then sort of a best case scenario and a worst case scenario, even though there's probably even better and worse, but these are sort of bracket plus or minus 90% of the or 80% of the possibilities. And under the best case, this would be a 1-year recession, be back to where we were by the middle of next year. This is showing the baseline forecast by about the middle of next year, or by the end of next year, sorry, and the worst case not until 2023. This is based on GDP. If we look at, let's skip over this one for a second. If we look at employment, though, it takes a lot longer for employment to return to normal. It won't be until the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, before it'll return under the top two cases. In the worst case, we have a double dip recession because the pandemic does resurge, and we do have some lockdowns. And so it's not until near the end of the decade by the time we get back to where we were. That one. So the differences between the scenarios can be seen probably most easily in their unemployment rate forecasts. So we expect that while we've seen a huge drop in the unemployment rate from its peak, it's going to be slow going and only down by about a percentage point from here on out in the baseline case. On the best case, it could continue a rather substantial decline, but even in the best case, it never gets back to that 3.5% rate that we were at before the pandemic began. In the worst case, the unemployment rate starts to go back up again before again trending down towards what really Moody's believes to be the long-run unemployment rate for the economy. Those scenarios don't take account anything about what happens in the election, but the election will have impacts, and so they did a separate analysis. So just wanted to show quickly that under a Republican sweep or a split Congress, it's basically the same as the baseline forecast that I've shown you. But if the Democrats were to sweep everything, the House, the Senate, and the presidency, then there's likely to be a much bigger stimulus package, a much bigger public works program, and so on moving forward that would have a positive impact for the economy. So turning locally, we see the same kind of pattern, although we've actually done a little bit better than the nation. We've recovered about 60% of our jobs here, as opposed to just over 50% for the U.S. The unemployment rate, shows that same steep drop, but it has leveled off, and progress again seems to be much slower now. We've had quite a bit of construction, so $3.9 billion worth of construction in the region. So that's one thing that seems to have kept relatively strong. Although it did slow down a bit, and in part, I think that was because, in terms of starts, the airport actually started last period as opposed to this year. But residential construction has been up, especially in the last year. It's been up a little bit in terms of the value, both single family and multifamily. The green line there is the institutional investment, showing that the airport had started. That activity is ongoing though, and so the level of construction activity is still relatively high. The one line that I wanted to point out to you is the orange line, which is industrial, which showed a big 62% jump this year, as we're building lots of warehouses to accommodate people shopping at home and needing quick delivery of goods and services. So we've got a really diverse economy here. And this is just showing you the major sectors. The other point I wanted to make is that the employment data that we use for this forecast includes the self-employed. It also puts public education inside government and shows you the vulnerability of state and local government and the importance of it if tax revenues slip and there is no additional support in another stimulus package. That it's our fourth largest employer. And so could have a significant impact on the local economy. We tend to mirror the U.S. economy, but we don't exactly mirror it. The industries at the top are the things that we specialize in. Management of companies reflects back office operations, good federal civilian presence, professional scientific technical services, our tech sector, finance and insurance, and wholesale trade and transportation, warehousing are the sectors that we have a larger than average specialty in, tend to produce those goods and services for the rest of the country. I'll just point out manufacturing. We have some of our particular industries like auto manufacturing are definitely exporting to the rest of the world, but overall our manufacturing sector is a little bit less represented in our economy than it is nationwide. Looking at how the pandemic recession has panned out so far, arts and entertainment, accommodation, and food definitely are the ones that have been hit hardest. But some of our specialties like finance and insurance, management of companies, professional scientific services are more resilient on the downswing, and they also propel us in the upswing. Construction also is powerful, and some of the sectors that are sort of more bouncy, I'll call them, administrative services and professional, just sort of other services will bounce back relatively quickly as well. Overall, we see that we're going to, because of our industrial structure, we're slightly better off than the U.S., a little bit faster than the U.S., at least in the short run, and that helps our economy, so that it pushes our recovery back to the when we are at our pre-recession peak, about a year ahead of the nation. And I'm just showing you the Great Recession by comparison. It was much longer recession, and it took twice as long to recover the pre-recession peak, but it was also about half as deep as this one. And unemployment, we grow a little bit faster than the U.S. in part because we're a low-cost place to do business, and the same output increase tends to pull more employees back into the labor force a little bit faster than the U.S. So we're growing about a percentage point faster than the U.S. in terms of employment. And overall, just looking at the totals, fourth quarter, we'll experience about a decline of nearly 80,000 compared to last year. And then we'll have a few years of above average growth as we claw our way back to where we were, and then growth drops off again as we sort of return to long-term rates consistent with the growth of the labor force. And the labor force is only going to grow about a 0.5% a year, so that growth is consistent might be slower than we're used to. We convert that into occupations to try and get a sense of who is being affected. This is just showing you the which occupations are the largest, and some of the lower paid ones are actually the largest. So that influences what happens to our economy. Again, food prep, arts and design, personal care, those are the ones hardest hit. The more tech-oriented and more sophisticated, higher skill occupations are the ones that seem to be relatively protected in the downturn. And coming out of it, though, there's several lower paid jobs that do relatively well. So healthcare support, building grounds, personal care services all bounce back, but construction and computer, mathematical, business occupations bounce back the fastest. These forecasts are broadly consistent with what I consider what's been called a K-shaped recovery, where the high wage workers are doing better and are about back to where they were, but low wage workers are still hurting considerably. We convert our occupation forecasts into unemployment forecasts or employment forecasts by race by looking at the demographic profile in each occupation. You can see that in the downturn, everyone hurts, although Blacks and Hispanics are hurt the most. But in the upturn is when inequities tend to rear their ugly head the most as disparities reemerge. And again, we see that whites and Asians are expected to see employment growth significantly faster than Blacks and Hispanics. The things that keep me up at night, we still have 53,000 fewer jobs than pre-recession levels, and a lot of those were renters. And so, 18,000 folks could be subject to eviction because they've lost their jobs unless some kind of relief is provided. So if there are a lot of evictions, that could have ancillary effects in the rest of the economy. The forecast assumes consumer spending will continue to increase, but that's all dependent on the pandemic and whether this third wave actually causes people to have to hunker down a little bit more, and whether additional stimulus comes from Congress. our forecast sort of assumes all the nice things will happen, all the positive things will happen. That's the baseline assumptions. And so retail sales, in fact, do recover, which would help prevent large-scale government layoffs. But I think that's also something that is worrisome if there is no second or third additional stimulus package. This is just showing you the pattern that we will still end up about 2% higher than last year, and then we have some above average growth as the economy accelerates, and then sort of falls back to more normal rates. Here I'm looking at businesses, small businesses. You can't see that very well. I'm sorry, but this is small businesses openings, and they are gradually declining. So there's more closures going on right now. So while there's no wave of bankruptcies, it is worrisome that the trend is down. And so in summary, as I've done these forecasts every month, basically for the last year, the forecast has gradually gotten better. The number, we're sort of coming in closer to the high end of the range than the low end of the range, rather than sort of the middle of the range when we started. We still gained about 60% of our jobs, so that's good, but that's 40% that's left. Going gets tougher from here. We'll fully recover by the first quarter of 2023, a year faster than the US, and it's because of the specializations that we have. Recessions are equalizing, but recoveries tend to exacerbate inequality, and economic growth and equality really are two sides of the same coin. They aren't really competing. We can't really grow to our full potential unless the economy works for all. And we have an initiative that the Chamber is a founding member of, as are we at MARC and the Civic Council and the Area Development Council, to try and produce an economy that grows for everyone. They've developed these pillars of prosperity that we hope everyone can help us fulfill. And I'll just end with, to grow the economy for everyone is a challenge, and no one can do it alone. And so we need all of us to work together on it. And I'll stop.
Please welcome Managing Director, Commercial Banking at BMO Harris Bank, Chad Rock.
Good morning, everybody. BMO Harris is excited to once again this year be a sponsor of the Economic Forecast Breakfast. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce the moderator of the panel discussion, Dr. Chris Kuehl. Dr. Kuehl is a managing director of Armada Corporate Intelligence and one of the co-founders of the company in 1999. He is the chief economist for the National Association for Credit Management, the economic analyst for the Fabricators and Manufacturers Association, and the chief editor for the Business Intelligence Briefs, which are distributed all over the world by business organizations. He makes close to 100 presentations each year to business and industry associations in the US and overseas. Chris has a doctorate in political economics and advanced degrees in Soviet studies and Asian studies. He was a professor of international economics and finance for over 15 years prior to starting Armada. Welcome, Chris. I'll now turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. And whenever I hear intros like this, it always makes it seem like I can't hold a job. So it's fun to be back with Frank. I never disagree with anything Frank has to say. There's always been this desire on the part of organizations to get dueling economists, but that never works with Frank and I. The only thing I'm really going to comment on, in addition to what Frank was discussing, had to do with what's happening both internationally and to a certain extent nationally. We're dealing with a very unusual recession. This was something that had no organic origins. This was not something we could particularly prepare for. Usually we see a recession beginning to set up sometime in advance, and we're always in a position to sort of make plans. This time we were not. We were doing quite well January and February. We were on our way to probably 2.6, 2.7% growth. We had 3.5% unemployment, and then literally it stopped. And we ended up with a very skewed recession. It's been referred to as a shutdown recession, a lockdown recession. And the reason for that terminology is simply that it was an artificially imposed reaction to another threat. We are in a very unique position of having to deal with both a pandemic and an economic dislocation occurring at the same time. And no matter what you do to address one of these, the other one is going to have a negative reaction. So anything we do to control COVID makes the economy worse, and vice versa. What we're now dealing with is an international set of dominoes in a way. We're beginning to see the recovery taking shape in Asia, which is encouraging because that was where it first originated, and we're hoping that that becomes a pattern to follow. Now we're watching Europe very closely. We're trying to determine whether or not some of the plans that were executed there would make sense here. We're all sort of waiting for the vaccine development, which would change a lot of the forecast for next year and in the years to come. As we talk about this for the rest of the panel, I think it's important to recognize that really it's the personal interactions and the personal stories that matter the most. We are very familiar with the big numbers now. We know there's lots of people unemployed. We know the GDP has fallen, but now we are spending a lot more energy on understanding what that means to the individuals that have been affected by this, the businesses in our community, the businesses around the country, the businesses around the world, and the individuals that have been caught up in this. Because this was a service sector recession, much more than it was a professional sector or even a manufacturing sector, we are seeing a particularly vulnerable part of the population most affected. These are people in hospitality and travel and entertainment, and these are service sector jobs, which is a dominant part of the US economy, but these are people that don't have a lot of resiliency when it comes to their ability to cope with this kind of recession. And that was something Frank pointed out, I think, quite effectively. So as we talk with the panel, we're going to get a lot more of that kind of personal interaction and get some of those stories. The three people that you're going to be hearing from today include Daniel Serda of LISC, Dr. Faisal Khan of Samuel U. Rodgers, and Amy Slattery of Odimo. And I think what you'll hear from them is what breaks this down from being kind of esoteric, almost an intellectual exercise, and makes it considerably more personal. And with that, I will start turning this over to the panel. I think first up is Daniel, if I'm not mistaken. So if you would like to proceed, that would be great.
That's correct. Good morning, Chris. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone. At Greater Kansas City LISC, we have launched an initiative a few years ago called KC Cure that I manage. And the focus of that is to promote catalytic redevelopment of Kansas City's east side, specifically the area within the Urban Neighborhood Initiative boundary, which was a Chamber Big Five initiative from several years ago. It's an area of about 10 square miles, 8 neighborhood areas, roughly Truman Road to the UMKC campus, Truce to Prospect. Within that area, we undertook a survey last year and identified about 1,200 total businesses in the larger east side area. Within that specific area, about 500 operating businesses. And we're able to actually identify through work of a consultant that nearly 50% of those businesses operating in that area were actually women or minority owned. We did further surveying of those women and minority-owned businesses and were able to flesh out a picture of a very robust functioning economy that is often overlooked on Kansas City's east side. A couple of key things to note about the nature of businesses on the east side. The first is that of the businesses we were able to identify and survey, nearly 2/3 are micro enterprises, meaning that they're businesses that employ 3 or fewer full-time employees. I think there's a tendency when you think about business in any neighborhood area to think a lot about retail and storefronts. And one of the things that we learned from our data is that that belies really the nature of the underlying functioning economy. Nearly 40% of the businesses we identified are actually engaged in services, not retail. They're providing professional services. They're providing either B2B or other kinds of consumer services and not retail per se. It includes everyone from small scale tax preparers, people that are working from home, doing accounting, doing insurance sales, to companies that are providing, for example, commercial janitorial services for commercial buildings downtown and throughout the city. A few key things about these businesses that we honed in on, and that really two key findings of the work that we did were focusing on the needs that these businesses have in accessing capital, and more specifically, the needs and challenges that they have in accessing technical assistance. I could talk about this in more detail in a little bit, but what I want to say here is that most of the businesses that we encountered have had very significant challenges in accessing traditional bank capital. They evinced a need to have more technical assistance in accessing non-traditional sources of capital. And the kinds of capital they needed was the kind of capital that every business needs. Operating capital, especially short-term operating capital, lines of credits that would allow them to build their workforce, to build their competitive position in the marketplace, and to expand their real estate. We're using that data to devise a strategy to help support those through the local entrepreneurial support network, and also to provide better capital financing tools for those small businesses. But again, I think the key thing to explore here as we go forward are that these businesses were already in a precarious position prior to COVID. We know that COVID has raised consciousness about the economic and racial disparities in our community. And what we really want to focus on is how to bridge that and how to see in all of the challenges and the crisis that we have before us, new opportunity for really reinventing that local economy.
Thank you very much. And I think our next speaker is Dr. Khan from Samuel U. Rodgers. And if you would like to weigh in, I know that he is like I, struggling with technology today. He's limited to his phone. I'm doing this from a hotel. So one way or the other, we're getting this to the Kansas City audience.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you to the Chamber for allowing me to participate in this. I'd just like to make a couple of points at the outset about how this pandemic and the economic recession that has come with it has impacted the health status indicators of the population in the greater Kansas City area. The fact is that, as Frank pointed out earlier, disparities or inequities were not created by this pandemic. They've merely been exposed and even exacerbated 3 or 4-fold over by this pandemic. If you had asked me 1 year ago whether a community health center like Samuel U. Rodgers would become a food distribution site for the community, I would have said rather cynically, you know what, that's not part of our mission. A year later, my goodness, that is probably the greatest area of need that we're seeing at the moment, and that tells you something. So beyond the economic forecasts, beyond the pie charts and the graphs that can obscure the picture, the fact is that food insecurity, housing insecurity, a lack of access to affordable healthcare are very real issues that this pandemic has exposed and exacerbated way beyond anyone's estimation. The rates of eviction across the Kansas City area are going up, and they have gone up throughout the pandemic. And as Frank pointed out, we really don't have a complete picture on that until a few years after the pandemic hopefully has passed. We're seeing much the same thing with our patient population. More and more people are presenting with the inability to make a minimal copay, and I'm talking to the tune of $10 to $20 to $30 for a dental procedure or a physician's visit. We don't turn anyone away. That is our mission. And so we absorb the cost of that care. And we've seen the number of such individuals and families go through the roof. The second point I'd like to make is the fact that the true impact on the individual's financial health, as well as any family's financial health throughout this pandemic, is yet to be seen or measured. We have some models and postulates that seem to reflect on the fact that the recovery is on its way. However, the sobering fact is that roughly 1 out of 4 Americans and roughly 2 out of 4 families are one major medical bill away from having their finances ruined, from having their financial investments, their retirement plans absolutely torn to shreds. That's not a good situation to be in. The pandemic didn't create that mess, it only exposed it. And that speaks to a larger malaise and issue of an existential crisis, if you ask anyone within the public health sector or the healthcare sector, that exists in the United States. I have to ask the audience to ponder over this point. Why is it that places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Britain, and large parts of Europe don't experience the same thing? I know you're going to be tempted to call me a socialist, but that's okay. It's because they have universal health care. Ask any American who's ever been abroad, even in the midst of the pandemic, and God forbid has come down with a life-threatening illness or needed surgery. They haven't gone bankrupt. They haven't been presented with a $100,000 bill. I speak from some experience because 1 week ago, we had an individual come into our health center who had suffered, whose spouse contracted COVID, was transported by ambulance to an area hospital, and they ended up receiving a bill for $72,000 between the ambulance transport service and the hospital. Now I ask you to multiply that by a factor of 20. That is the issue that we're dealing with in the healthcare sector. All of us have struggled. The healthcare safety net was at risk of going under, I kid you not, in March and April. We depend for 1/3 of our annual operating revenue on billable services, things that we provide and bill for. That fell through the ceiling.
Dr. Khan, we're going to have to move on to Amy from Odimo, but we do have opportunity to come back. We want to talk about some of the questions that were posed earlier, but Amy Slattery from Odimo has yet another perspective and is a small business owner and an architect.
Thanks, Chris. I'm really just honored to be part of this panel. I'm a big fan of Chris. I've seen his economic forecasts over the years at CCIM breakfasts, and I'm just honored to kind of represent the perspective of small businesses that I'm connected with and to share my story. I started Odimo about 5 years ago. We had a very steep trajectory in growth because of this city. It's a great entrepreneurial city. We focus in higher education and affordable housing, and then select commercial work in the urban core. And that strategic diversity has enabled our growth. We really experienced firsthand the downturn that hit us in March. We were really on a steep trajectory going into the first quarter of 2020 to be continuing that growth. But everything really slowed very quickly, primarily due to a large public project with the city that is still on hold, really pending funding. We were able to recover really due to our relationships and continued work with the university, particularly with UMKC. We've been doing some work with them in some of their COVID funded projects, their CARES funded projects. And that's really kept us busy here in the fall. We're optimistic going forward because of our connections in the city and the relationships with both the chamber, these kinds of opportunities, and also the support from the small business development organizations in Kansas City. I did a lot of work kind of prepping and thinking about the growth of the company through programs like Scale Up KC and the Kauffman Fast Track program. Those really enabled us to have a footing, and now we actually have some space and time to implement some of the things that we learned during our growth. So we've been really investing back in the company from a financial management standpoint, some of our technical and project management work. but then also a strategic business marketing and value propositioning work that's hopefully going to propel us forward. My relationships with many other small businesses, I think a lot of people have had a really tough time. And I agree that the PPP loan was instrumental in us making it through the second quarter. And I have several colleagues from Scale Up who didn't get it or are still waiting on their next funding opportunity. So I'm really optimistic, but also agree with the idea of kind of a cultural and systemic change that needs to happen for our small businesses to gain better access to capital. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, we're going to start with some questions that were developed before the panel began. One of them addressed to Daniel is, we know that the past 8 months have been hard on businesses. We know the minority-owned and women-owned businesses are hardest hit. What are you hearing from East Side businesses around their experiences through the pandemic?
Well, we've heard things on a couple fronts, Chris. Anecdotally, I had been hearing through a lot of the outreach work I've been doing that access to capital had been, this was a year before the pandemic, had been a real issue. What we've heard since that time is just aggravation and complication of those circumstances. Amy referenced PPP, and I know you probably want to talk about that in a little more detail later, but I will tell you, we've tried to assist several businesses, small businesses, minority-owned businesses this spring in obtaining PPP, and we're not able to do it. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that, PPP is intended to supplement or replace payroll expenditures. Many of these businesses, because the way that they're structured, either as LLCs or sole proprietorships, are not necessarily accounting for or able to document employee and payroll expenses. They rely on 1099 contractors. It may be very uneven in terms of their disbursements. We had one company that we put a lot of effort in trying to help, and unfortunately, they had, the last 2 years, had actually declared net losses. And you cannot obtain PPP if you had net losses in the past year or two. You have to base it on positive revenues going forward. So, there are real significant challenges that were already out there. And as Dr. Khan said, and as Amy said, those are circumstances that have just been revealed and really unmasked in this and made much more apparent in terms of how deeply they impact a lot of these smaller scale, more precarious businesses.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And I have a question for Dr. Khan. Preface this a little bit by saying, in the beginning, I was identified as having a degree in Soviet studies. Trust me, universal healthcare is not socialism. People need to remember that we once had a really socialist country. It's gone now. So a question. When you look at the Samuel Rodgers health system, it serves many people living in poverty. What would be the top 2 or 3 things that would help these people, important members of the workforce right now, amid a recession and a global pandemic?
So the best way I can answer that is by reiterating what an abundance of science has already proved, which is that your health status outcomes are determined in only small part by the amount and quality of clinical care you receive. It's only about 10 to 15%. The other 80% of your health status is determined by things outside the healthcare arena, things like safe, affordable, and healthy housing, transportation, access to nutritious and affordable food, social support, and access to safe and healthy recreational facilities, and not having to worry about the basics that so many of us take for granted. It is that part of the health and social safety care net that has really been decimated, not just by the pandemic, but by economic issues and political issues over the last 10 to 20 years, I would say. And so that really is where we as a community health center have had to step up our game to think beyond just high quality primary medical and dental care and help link people with the United Way, with Harvesters, with Goodwill, and then in a case management setting, do warm handshake referrals and follow-ups to see whether or not their needs have been met. I wish I could go out and hire a whole army of community health workers help our patient population right now. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of what we're seeing right now.
Oh, very good. And then a question for Amy that's kind of in the same vein. How have you seen the small business community come together during this crisis and support each other?
I think early on, we were almost daily, if not weekly, connecting with each other on Zoom. There was really an abundance of resources and a lot of outreach, both from the chamber and from the SBDC. And because we had that network, I think I was able to kind of share and get support. And just some of it was very emotional support, but also just feedback loops on how they were approaching the PPP and the best way to kind of talk with your banker and some things like that. So over the last few months, I would say in March, we were very optimistic. And I think we thought it was going to be a very short period. And then in May, we felt maybe more optimistic because we were opening back up. And now here we are in October, and that optimism is really starting to drain. I think we're not connecting as much as we were in March. I think because a lot of people have had to pivot and think about a new approach to their business. So I think the more that we can continue to stay in touch, and also to continue to buy local, to purchase local, and to feed the local economy as much as we're able to, I think that's how we're going to continue to come together. I will say some small businesses have been able to sustain and see an increase and taken some opportunities, but there's still a large number who obviously are not doing well and are having to look about for new opportunities.
Very good. Now, Daniel offered a quote a little earlier, which I think is a great send-off for all three of you to talk about the future, when he said, a quote from Albert Einstein, "In the midst of every crisis lies opportunity." And that also reminds me of an old Scottish proverb that says, "It's an ill wind that blows nobody good." We've got opportunities now because the world has changed. Is there something in the way of an opportunity that you have seen open up because of the crisis, because of the economic changes? How do you see the future shaking out? And you can kind of fight each other as to who talks now. There's no order to this. But we can start with Daniel because it was his quote.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Because I am an optimist, I'm always trying to kind of balance that approach and trying to balance the irrational side of that. I think our opportunities have been reworking the business and to think about staying focused in our markets and going deeper with our relationships and continuing to stay in our line and in the lane that we want to be in. We've also had instead of pivoting, we've been able to spend more time connecting to our community and to get to know neighborhood associations better before we are with a developer on an affordable housing project. We're deepening those efforts. We've also had the opportunity to take on some nonprofit work and provide pro bono services for a few small businesses and the nonprofit side. I think staying local and thinking what local really means in terms of design and community is something we continue to look at. So we were kind of on a trajectory to start to look at other states, and we're really focusing back in on the Kansas and Missouri region, and I think that's going to really serve us well. So that's where I see our personal business opportunity. I think the re-examining the culture of finance and how small businesses gain access to capital and everything we're starting to talk about with health, I think as a culture and as a city, that's something we really need to take the time and focus in on.
So I was going to say, I think it starts with awareness, and there's an awareness now of inequality that just wasn't present. The inequality was there. It's been revealed. It's been unmasked. And I think that's been seen. The question is, are we going to do long-term what there really has not been a willingness to do, Dr. Khan said over the last decade or two, which is to significantly think about reshaping both our public and as well as our private investment priorities. I will tell you, the businesses that we're trying to support, they're in the throes of crisis right now, and in the near term, the question is one of resiliency. Are they going to be able to bounce back? Are they going to be able to weather the storm? Are they going to be able to press forward? Longer term, I think I mentioned this in the prep call. I think this is really fundamentally an issue of regional competitiveness. Kansas City acknowledges, though it doesn't always confront, the reality that we have a long tradition of significant inequality in our city. If we take that bull by the horn, so to speak, and we really confront it, we change and reshuffle our priorities. We are able to redirect both, as I said, private and public investments in ways that are much more substantive. We should be able to come out of this not in a way that simply makes us more resilient, but in a way that potentially makes us regionally more competitive, that draws in businesses that are part of our functioning local economy, helps them grow, helps them expand, helps share wealth throughout the community, helps provide livelihood and meet all of those social and economic needs that Dr. Khan was referencing in a more substantive way. We cannot be a competitive city with the kinds of social and economic deficits that we've struggled with over the last couple of decades. But again, this is going to require significant concerted public and private will to do and to really address over the next several years.
Dr. Khan, what would you add?
I believe in cautious optimism. I could not agree more with Amy and Daniel. There are some good things on the horizon. Medicaid expansion will become a reality in Missouri in 2021. Fingers crossed, if the legislature doesn't mess around with it and allows it to go through in its true intent. Upwards of 210,000 Missourians, perhaps more, now that the pandemic has created more need, will become eligible to receive Medicaid coverage. That's not necessarily a positive indicator because the thresholds for income, as we all know, for Medicaid eligibility are so ridiculously low that it almost highlights an issue. In the long term, however, as Daniel pointed out, this is going to require significant investment in the social support structure that we currently lack in Missouri and the greater Kansas City area, for that matter. Your businesses, the robust economy that we all dream about only exists because we have a robust and healthy workforce. And the lack of the latter will, of course, damage our aims and ambitions. That's probably where I would put it.
And I would only add in terms of all this that we have really faced an international and national crisis, which we do all the time, but we rarely recognize it as such. And what I'm really hoping happens from here is that we become a great deal more cooperative at a national and international level, because we're dealing with things right now, COVID, but climate change and just all of these things that have become impossible for any one entity, any one country to handle on its own. And I'm really hoping that this galvanizes people's idea of cooperation and doing things in a more unified way, because as you've all pointed out, we can't really deal with this in any kind of an atomized structure. What other things do you want the business community to know? You're sort of all in a position now of speaking to a pretty broad audience. The chamber audience is made up of big business, small business, middle-sized business, political leaders, cultural leaders. What message do you want to leave them today?
Once again, healthcare costs in the United States are a major issue, and for businesses of all sizes, meeting those costs for employees is going to be a major challenge. They're only going one way, and that is up. We are paying more for less and less volume and quality of healthcare, frankly. That really must change. And so if I had one appeal to make of all business leaders and entrepreneurs, start screaming about that, because that really goes to the health and safety of your workforce and productivity and profitability in the long term.
Daniel, do you
I
have
was
any
going to say,
ideas? Yeah.
I think there's, a begrudging acceptance of the realities that are confronting us. And one of the things I often hear in polite discussion is, really, at the same time, there's an acknowledgement, there's also denial that we really have systemic imbalances and systemic issues going on. Let me just highlight that in one specific way. As I said, in the research work we did last year as part of developing our program strategy to support minority and women-owned businesses, we asked them specifically about capital access. And again, this was pre-COVID. This was almost a year ago. We heard from all of them that all of them had encountered really significant challenges in obtaining traditional bank financing. What they primarily wanted help with was looking at non-bank sources, looking at community development financial institutions like LISC and AltCap and others for assistance, maybe even trying to access dedicated funds that are targeted to women and minority-owned businesses. But why is that the case? Well, there are a lot of challenges. There are a lot of reasons for that. There are technical issues. There are lending standards. There are all of the barriers to the marketplace for borrowing that those minority businesses face. But there is no way to explain those away statistically without recognizing that there is systemic discrimination still going on in lending. There's just no way to do that. The Business Journal last week published, I think, a really revealing study, and they looked by census tract throughout the city at the degree of small business lending that's happening. They identified in 2018, $66.4 billion in small business loans that are $100,000 or less that were originated in majority white census tracts. By contrast, majority black census tracts only received $3.6 billion, barely 5% of the total. Per capita, because the population in some of those black census tracts is lower, that was still barely half of the amount of lending per capita in the black census tracts as in white census tracts. I deal with non-minority developers and business people who have difficulty accessing capital because of the geographic location of their businesses. It has nothing to do with their balance sheet. It has nothing to do with their credit scores. It has nothing to do with their profiles. It has to do with the geographic location of their business. And as I mentioned before, the businesses that are on the east side, although there's a sense that there isn't business and there isn't business investment on the east side, there are entrepreneurs out there and they're doing critically important work. And many of them are serving the same clientele at Crown Center, downtown, in Overland Park, out in Corporate Woods, as their competitors that might be out in Lee Summit or Blue Springs. They're just doing it in an environment where they have much more difficult in accessing the working capital that they need to make their businesses succeed. So again, recognition and awareness is the first step, but it's going to take sustained commitment to really make a dent and make significant progress in changing those outcomes. And again, I think in doing so, in the same way Dr. Khanna suggested, that's going to improve outcomes for everyone. It's going to improve the robustness of our regional economy. It's going to improve the health and welfare of people within those communities. It's certainly going to improve the livelihoods of those entrepreneurs that have been struggling in the face of a lot of systemic challenges.
Any final remarks, Amy?
I would say one thing that this has all taught me is that while we are local and impact locally and we're thinking about global work, we're still impacting globally by what we do right here. And so really thinking about how we're so interconnected and how we need to think about staying safe first and keeping our workforce and our employees and our community safe. So just wear a mask, please, and stay safe. The other thing would be to vote and to really get more active in our communities, but also to vote. And then one thing we talked about even in the prep was an interesting conversation in my mind was the idea that to get this economy really back on its feet, we need jobs, but we also need consumers. I thought that was a really good approach. And particularly in Kansas City, we should think about what makes us Kansas City. And it is the diversity of our small businesses. It's also our really outstanding arts programs and those performers and arts and nonprofit communities and organizations are really hurting. So I would encourage all of us to share what we have and to be a consumer. Even virtually, some of these virtual concerts have just been really amazing, but continue to give where you can and to invest in our city. And I feel like if we if we act that way, we can kind of move things forward and kind of come out of this stronger. So
very good. I'd like to thank the panel for their comments. And as moderator, I always get the last word. So the last word is simply that during crisis, we tend to come together. We have seen this time and time again when it's something like a hurricane or a tornado. This has been an odd crisis. It is an all-encompassing crisis, and it's subtle. It's one of those things where, you know, if there's a tornado, you know to show up and help clean up. Right now, the most noble response we can make is to put a mask on, and it feels a little short. But we need to sort of look at all of this as a national crisis, as a regional crisis, and band together as we often have before. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to the chairman of the chamber, Joe Reardon, and he will take us out and take you into the next section, which is the breakout rooms where you can get really down and specific with our panelists. Thank you very much.
Please welcome President and CEO of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, Joe Reardon.
Thanks so much, Chris, and good morning to everyone. Boy, that hour went by super fast. There's just so much here to talk about and to think through, and just greatly appreciative to everyone that's participated and for you being a part of it virtually as well. I want to thank Frank Lenk. He's on target, on time every year, and his outstanding work on our annual economic forecast for Kansas City, gave us some insights. It's nice to know that we've been recovering a bit more quickly than the rest of the nation. We know we have a ways to go. Several of you have already asked, and we will make available to every attendee a copy of Frank's PowerPoint so you can revisit some of the data, the really important data that he shared. I want to thank all of our panelists and Chris for leading us through a great discussion. I think it's been kind of good for me, maybe for you too, to think forward a little bit beyond where we are currently with COVID and what it means for our community and our country in trying to move forward, to bridge forward beyond the situation that we're confronted with. And I think 2021 at some point is going to be that time for us to think through these complex issues that have real world implications that we're witnessing right now, and what we need to do as a Kansas City region to propel forward and address those real issues. So a good panel, but we're not done. And so our panelists are going to go into discussion pods. We were kind of tired of talking about Zoom breakout rooms, so we're calling them discussion pods that you can join and ask them questions and enter into a dialogue. They'll each have their own discussion pod. And I believe in your chat, you're going to get links to those. And you also can look in your email because we sent those out to you as well. And if you click on one of those links, you're going to go right into that room or that discussion pod, and it's your opportunity to join the discussion. Finally, I'd like to thank again the sponsors of today's economic forecast, including BMO Harris Bank as our cornerstone sponsor. Thanks to them. And our impact sponsors, Black & Veatch, Blue KC, and SS&C. And a reminder, you'll find lots of data about our local economy at the Greater KC Report, which is a link in the top right corner of kcchamber.com. We've updated it with some relevant data around racial equity as well as impact of COVID in Kansas City. So in addition to Frank's PowerPoint that you'll be receiving, we'd ask you to go to our website and take a look at the KC Report, even more information there than there was last year. And I'd like to invite you to take that look, but first, let's join the panelists in our discussion pods and continue the conversation for a bit longer. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.